let's talk about depression and ADHD in teenage girls. Several studies in recent years have looked into the impact of ADHD on the lives of teenage girls. MRI studies report that teenagers' brains are rapidly maturing, but they're not fully mature until the early 20s in females and perhaps the early 30s in males, which explains a lot of my friends from high school. Long-term studies on behavior and emotional health report that girls with ADHD may experience some pretty big struggles through the teenage years. And there are other studies that report that depression is common among teenagers with ADHD. And in fact, it's so common among adolescents that the use of medications for ADHD, depression, antipsychotics, and even sleep medications is up sharply with adolescent girls. It has been reported that while many children and teens with ADHD also suffer from some degree of sadness or discouragement, as many as 25%, maybe as much as 30%, are clinically depressed. Children and teens with ADHD are as much as 300% more likely to also suffer from depression than are children or teens without ADHD. The depression doesn't seem to be associated with the ADHD symptoms such as inattention or impulsivity or hyperactivity or the academic problems. These problems might cause some discouragement or sadness or frustration, but not clinical depression. It seems rather that the clinical depression is most correlated with social awkwardness or interpersonal difficulties that are often a part of having ADHD. The lack of friendships, the sense of loneliness, or a sense of being a social outcast seem to be behind the depression in most of these young girls. And these feelings are, of course, much stronger in the teenage years than at any other time in life. In girls who were diagnosed with ADHD and were followed by long-term studies through the years, it was observed that as they moved from childhood to adolescence, their outward symptoms of ADHD, such as hyperactivity and impulsivity, tended to decrease. And we want to point out that most girls with ADHD do not have the symptoms of hyperactivity or impulsivity. Most girls with ADHD are inattentive, distracted, disorganized, kind of space cadets, which is why girls are so underdiagnosed for ADHD. Girls tend to just sit in the classroom, get distracted, and do poorly on the tests. But they don't cause trouble in the classroom, so they don't get the attention that might lead to a diagnosis and some treatment. But from those girls that did have the symptoms of hyperactivity or impulsivity and had been diagnosed as children, their outward symptoms tended to decrease as they reached the teenage years. However, as these girls reached those teenage years, it was noted that their academic performance continued to be a problem, and the academic gap between them and their non-ADHD peers just continued to widen with each passing year. These researchers also noted that while some girls with ADHD actually outgrew it as they reached adolescence, for the most part the girls not only continued to suffer from it, but many began to get into some serious trouble. Both behavioral and emotional problems began to emerge in many of these girls, and the need for specialized treatment greatly increased. There were increased problems with friends, which led to increased levels of depression. There were increased levels of substance abuse. Both alcohol and other drugs were abused. School delinquency increased as the academic problems got worse. And eating disorders became a serious problem among many of these girls, which was a big surprise to me. All of these problems were at higher levels among these ADHD girls than among their non-ADHD peers. As we've noted at the ADHD Information Library at newideas.net, twice as many teens with ADHD will run away from home than teens without ADHD. About 16% of teens run away from home at some point, but 32% of teens untreated for ADHD will run away at some point. And it's estimated that as many as 50% of all teenagers in juvenile facilities have ADHD, but were untreated for it. Teenagers untreated for ADHD are 10 times more likely to get pregnant or cause a pregnancy than those without ADHD. And teenagers untreated for ADHD are 400% more likely to get a sexually transmitted disease than teens without ADHD. 16% with ADHD untreated versus 4% in the general population of teenagers. With as many as 25% of teenagers with ADHD being clinically depressed, it's important to understand what depression looks like and why it's important to treat it and manage it, and the treatment options available to you. When we think of someone who's depressed, we usually picture a sad, tearful, lonesome person. But teenagers with depression don't look like adults with depression necessarily. Current studies show that there are about as many teenagers who are depressed as there are adults who are depressed, about 10% of the general population. And as we've noted, as many as 25% of teens with ADHD are depressed. However, depression in teenagers doesn't always look like depression in adults. Teenagers do not commonly display gloom, put themselves down, or talk about feeling hopeless or helpless like adults do. Teenagers with major depression are often described as becoming negative and antisocial. Feelings of wanting to leave home or wanting to run away tend to increase. There may be a strong sense of not being understood or approved of by parents or by siblings or by peers. And teens, as the teen changes and becomes more restless, grouchy, or aggressive, a reluctance to cooperate in family ventures and withdrawing from the family by retreating into the room is pretty common. The door is closed. School difficulties are likely even in those few ADHD teens who are doing pretty well in school, as concentration is even more affected than from the ADHD alone. Sometimes the teen will stop paying attention to personal appearance, and sometimes they'll adopt the uniform of social groups that profess depression or despondency as a way of life. You know, they start dressing in all black. It's black this and black that, and everything's black. They often become much more emotional at every little thing. Often there's an increased sensitivity to rejection in love relationships as well, which reminds me of a Cornell University study that reported that the leading cause of teenage depression was breaking up with a boyfriend or girlfriend, and that the younger the teen was in this relationship, the more likely the breakup would lead to depression. So parents, you've got to remember that. Teenage boys will often become aggressive with their parents or peers, seem more agitated around the house, and get into more trouble at home or at school or with the law. Teenage girls will sometimes become preoccupied with themes of death or dying and become decreasingly concerned about how they look. And again, think black. Black hair, black nails, black clothes, black lips, black, black.